on having them be vegetarian wasps.
Sorry, could you say that again?
I said I liked the play on saying that they were vegetarian wasps.
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
the little art doodle with that was pretty perfect. I liked all the knives
Thank you.
and the
Yeah,
grocery bags full of vegetables.
yeah. I wanted to include some humor into
It,
it.
it
So
was
it usually makes
great.
it a little more memorable. Um,
Yeah.
so we'll get a little bit deeper into bees now specifically. There are seven species or seven families of bees in the world. When it comes to North America and Washington specifically, there's six. Stenotrididae is found only in Australia, so unlikely to occur or to encounter that unless you go to Australia, and even then, they're still pretty rare. Um, and so these families are generally divided into short-tongued and long-tongued bees. Um, and they're, it's not the best way of dividing them, at least superficially. You're like, oh, okay, well, the short-tongued bees must have shorter tongues, and the long-tongued bees must have longer tongues. But it's specifically a one part of their tongue. And there are short-tongued bees that probably have longer tongues in the entire length than long-tongued bees. But scientifically speaking, there is a certain part of the tongue that they measure, and this is just sort of a way that we divide them. They also have common names that you might be more familiar with. Calididae are the cellophane bees because they make their brood cells with a lining around the brood cell that is similar to cellophane. It's like a little plasticky, plastic wrap sort of material. Andrenidae are the mining bees. Halictidae are the sweat bees. Melididae are oil bees. Megachilids, those are leafcutter and mason bees, which are my favorite. And then you have the apids, which are the honeybees, bumblebees, stingless bees, longhorn bees. There's not really a unifying common name for them, but they are also the most diverse of all of the bees in that family. So in terms of basic bee anatomy, like any other insect, bees they have three body segments. So head, thorax, abdomen, and they all have three pairs of legs attached to their thorax. Um, they all have four wings. As you guys learned earlier, they are connected by hamuli, which are a set of hooks, and they can couple those during flight and decouple them when they're walking around. Um, they all have five eyes, which, um, based on your experience and knowledge about insects, may come as a surprise. But yeah, you have your two compound eyes, and then not all insects, but most insects have three ocelli, and these are single lenses that mostly just determine sort of light and dark or like sudden movement. In a lot of insects, they're used to sort of track the length of days, since seasonality is like a really important thing with insects. Um, Most bees have scopy, as I had sort of alluded to earlier. That is hairs on their legs or abdomen or thorax. You can see that it has some pollen packed up in here. Um, so a lot of different bees, they all have different sorts of ways of carrying their pollen around. And again, some have corbiculae, like honeybees and bumblebees. And we'll figure out the mystery of this bee here. There are some species that are basically hairless and look like wasps. This is in the genus Hylaeus, and this is a bee that actually transports pollen and nectar internally. So it will ingest it all, and then when it gets back to the brood cell, it will regurgitate it, and that's how it transports pollen. So you're all probably thinking that I thought bees looked like this and that they live in colonies like this, and they make delicious honey that you can eat. And, you know, this discourse around bees is pretty misleading. Honeybees are obviously extremely important, but they also make up a very small percentage of bees in the world. And if you search Save the Bees, you get 22, maybe 23. No, not sure about that last bee. It's kind of hard to say. But most of these are honeybee form drawings. Um, Only a handful are probably some other type of bee, maybe a bumblebee. Um, so in the spirit of that, let's do a little bee quiz. So, in your head, just think about your answers to these questions. Um, First one is approximately how many species of native bees live in North America? And the answer to that is 4,000. There are a lot of bees in North America, and especially in like the Pacific, the Southwest, or I mean, even in Eastern Washington, there's an extremely high diversity of bees, mostly dry areas. And the second question is roughly what percentage of bees are considered social? So something that you're familiar with, like honeybees that have a queen and workers. And that's 10%. So sociality in bees is definitely the exception rather than the rule. And here's like a visual for that. This is from a probably one of my favorite books, The Solitary Bees. So if you're interested in learning more about bees, I would highly recommend reading that. Um, and this is just showing different sociality of bees around the world. So you have, again, a little under 10% that are social. 13% are brood parasites, which we'll get into later. And then, again, over three-quarters of them are considered solitary. And I shouldn't forget the little tiny sliver of green, which are social parasites. We'll also get into that in a bit. So using terms like social and solitary are helpful, but it also makes it seem like bees fall into these clearly defined categories of social organization. That's not true. Uh, it just makes it easier to discuss them, but there are a lot of different ways that bees organize their lives, and some of that can depend on like environmental factors. So some species might be social in hot weather, and they might be solitary in colder weather. But in terms of, for the purposes of this presentation, I would probably define them in this manner, where solitary may involve some like interaction between individual females as they're provisioning their nests, um, but they're not actually like working together. And then social is more, there are, we'll get into definitions about sociality, but essentially cooperation and like coordination among bees to reproduce. So for solitary bees, um, that generally means that there's one female and she provisions her own nest by herself. And about 70% of solitary bees also nest in the ground. The remainder nest in cavities. So that might be like your mason bees if you have mason bee nesting blocks in your yard or something. Those are solitary bees that nest in the same spots, but they're all working independently. Some also construct freestanding nests. So, like pebble bees can collect resin and stick little pieces of pebbles together, and they'll make little brood cells on the side of like stems. Um, and again, to sort of uh, focus on the idea of sociality being a spectrum, many solitary bees also nest in aggregations. So, a good example, if you're not familiar with it, is in southeast Washington, you have the alfalfa farmers, and alfalfa is generally pollinated by alkali bees. Um, and those alkali bees nest in the millions, like there are millions of holes of individual females, um, just for acres and acres. But that's an example of a solitary bee that nests gregariously. So they're not actually cooperating in nest provisioning. They're just living in the same place. Um, and in general, bees live as an adult for like a little over a month, but their total lifespan is about a year. So, from when their mother laid an egg, they hatched as a larvae, and then they overwintered underground or in a stem or something. And then they emerge as an adult for a little over a month, maybe less. And that's the bee life cycle. And this picture sort of epitomizes, again, that blurriness of bee sociality. So these are two agapostomen females, so green sweat bees, and they nest communally. So there's an aggregation, so like a dirt bank that has, I don't know, dozens of holes in it, and each of those holes is used by multiple females to enter. But then once underground, they branch off into their own individual uh, cells that they're provisioning by themselves. So, these are like precursors to sociality, you could say, where this sort of behavior might evolutionarily lead to a eusocial species where there's actually a queen and workers. But in general, native bees um, have some sort of life cycle that looks like this, where you have an adult, she provisions a hole in the ground with pollen and nectar, lays a single egg on top of it, which is basically just a blob, an amorphous blob with no limbs. And it just sits on that food provision and eats it until it's big enough to molt into a pupa, and then that pupa will overwinter underground. When the conditions are right, whether that's, I don't know, humidity, moisture, temperature, um, that bee will then turn into an adult and repeat that cycle. And so these are a couple examples of what those cells and those brood cells might look like. So on the top, you have leafcutter bees that haven't, so it's not as clear where the divisions are, but you can basically see them. So like this would be one cell, so there's one bee in there. This would be another cell, and they just do that horizontally across that cavity. Um, Same thing here with resin bees. So they are using resin as the partitions between cells. And of course, you can see the larvae in there that have already eaten all of their provisions. It doesn't always succeed. You can see that these ones did not develop properly. And then you have mason bees, which use mud to partition their cells. And their young actually also create a cocoon for themselves. Just to focus a little more on leafcutter bees because I like them so much. Um, this is kind of just the process of a leafcutter bee female going about her brood cell provisioning. So she cuts with her mandibles a little piece of leaf. If you ever look in your garden and you see little perfectly like semicircular cuttings off of your leaves, you can be pretty confident that it's a leafcutter bee that was doing that. And then they fly it back to their nest, like on like a little magic carpet, and then they roll them up into these cells, like I showed earlier, fill it with pollen and nectar, and then lay an egg and seal it up. And then eventually that bee will come out, hopefully the next year. And if it's a male, it'll go out looking for females. If it's a female, it'll repeat this process herself. So social bees, um, you'll recognize obviously honeybees, but in terms of bees that are native to North America, bumblebees are probably the most recognizable social bees here. Um, and to be considered truly social, there are certain characteristics that a type of bee has to have. The first one is they need a reproductive division of labor. And essentially that means that some females are biologically incapable, or at least like do not attempt to reproduce. Uh, the second character is they have cooperative brood care, which means that you have individuals that are caring for young that they did not themselves create. And then the third condition that they need is to have overlapping generations within that colony. And so lower forms of sociality can have, one or two, but not all of those. So an example of that might be like a colony of bees where the colony still cares for their sister's offspring, but they're not actually infertile themselves, and they may eventually later that year, produce their own offspring. So it might be more fluid in that sense. When it comes to bumblebees, this is the cycle that they go through every year. Uh, in the spring, you'll have queens emerge from their overwintering sites and they'll fly around. So these are the big females that you see flying around usually in spring. Some people I think have already seen some this year, probably fooled by some of the fluctuating temperatures. Um, but yeah, usually around like March or something, it will start to emerge with regularity. We'll look around for a place that seems suitable for to build a nest. That's usually like an abandoned rodent hole or something. Could even be like a bird house in your tree. Um, and then they will start going out and foraging for their first like wave of workers. Once the workers hatch, the female or the queen never leaves the nest again. She'll stay in there just reproducing and laying more eggs. Eventually, so bumblebees are just a year-long colony. They don't last multiple years. In the late summer and fall, when the floral resources start to diminish, the hive will start producing more queens and males, and they'll mate before the end of the season. The males will die, and those new queens will go dig themselves what's called a hibernaculum, which is just basically a fancy word for a little burrow in the ground. And they'll sleep until the next spring, and then they'll emerge and do that all over again. But there are other social bees that are around. The top left and the top right are probably like the two most common species, at least in my experience, um, in Washington. So two bees in the genus Halictus, so sweat bees, and they're small and that they don't, they're not going to produce like a giant colony with honey or anything, but they do have at least primitive eusocial behaviors. So they'll have like a queen and brood care. They'll usually just be in like a small hole underground. On the other hand, you have stingless bees that are not in North America. Well, they're probably in Mexico, but not in the United States. These are another example of a social bee that is fully social. It has queen and it has workers, and they also produce honey. People in the tropics definitely harvest stingless bee honey. And then on the bottom right, we have the European honeybee. And then the last type of lifestyle are the parasitic or cuckoo bees. So this is the other bee that I mentioned earlier that didn't have pollen collecting hairs. And the reason for that is because of its kleptoparasitic lifestyle. So essentially what that means is that all bees that are parasitic are taking advantage of the provisioning work that was done by other solitary bees. So they don't go around collecting pollen and nectar. They let the other bees do that work for them. And then when the time is right, that could be while the nest is still open and the host bee is still provisioning it. Um, or it could be after the nest is all closed up. They will find a way in and they will either, the adults themselves will destroy the host egg or larva, or their larvae are often adapted to kill themselves. So they'll have like big jaws and their larvae will kill the host larvae, the larva itself. So again, it's a very like opportunistic lifestyle that if we were to sort of place our own human morals on, we might say they're like evil or bad or whatever, but it's just another way that life has found a way to reproduce. Um, and so with regards to like their physical attributes, again, they don't have any pollen collecting hairs. They're usually heavily armored. Uh, it's hard to really tell unless you've pinned a bunch of bees. But when you try to stick a pin through a parasitic bee, it's generally pretty difficult because their exoskeleton is like a lot more, it's not necessarily thicker, it's just the texture of it adds more structural integrity. And then when it comes to the females, they have modified like reproductive organs. So if you think about like a solitary bee, every egg they lay has to be accompanied by either a day or multiple days worth of collecting for their provisions. So they're not necessarily in a rush to lay a bunch of eggs. So their reproductive tract produces an egg every day, let's say. Whereas when it comes to a cuckoo bee, they might not get the opportunity for a bit to lay an egg, or they might get an opportunity to lay like 10 eggs in the short span of time. So they are usually, their reproductive organs are producing multiple eggs at once, and they'll have like five or something, let's say, ready to go at any given moment. Um, mhm.
Travis Swanland had a pretty good question. Does Varroa affect these other bees?
I don't think Varroa does, but there are um, pathogens that definitely get transferred from, I mean, at least from bumblebees to bumblebees, like introduced bumblebee species. Um, I think that's actually I mean, I'll sort of discuss the state of native pollinators and bees later, but um, in general, we just don't know that much. There are so many different species, both native and introduced, that it's likely that introduced species could be bringing pathogens and maybe parasites over from Europe or from Asia that we don't know yet how they're affecting native bees. There's just so little
Right.
known about individual species in general that it's hard to say.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Mhm. Um, so this so the top two photos are sort of pretty characteristic of what you'd see where you might find like a parasitic bee if you didn't see it actively like stalking out the nest of a different solitary bee. But again, these bees don't construct their own nests. They don't really have a home, for lack of a better term. So at night, or if it's too cold out, you'll just find them sort of clamped onto a piece of grass or some other sort of foliage, and that's just how they sleep. That's how they rest. They don't have anywhere else to go really, unless they find some sort of shelter. But oftentimes, if like you go out early in the morning at a place where you know there are a bunch of bees, if you look close enough, you'll find just bees clamped onto grass. It's pretty cool. Um, the bottom left photo is a Sphecodes that is actively digging a finished brood cell or nest from a bee. So this must, I don't know what species it is specifically, but it must be one that they specialize on parasitizing already closed cells. And so it's digging up where it might, sense or there might be a scent of the host bee there, and so it's been, I actually watched it for a bit, just like digging up soil slowly but surely. I don't know if it actually succeeded, but that's their type of parasitism. And then on the bottom right, you have a social parasite. So that little tiny green sliver that you saw on the pie chart earlier were social parasites. And this is an example of that. So Bombus, which is the bumblebee genus, most of them are social, but some are parasitic. So um, it's even more, I guess, insidious in our like sort of anthropomorphized version of bees, their behavior, because instead of just like going in and laying an egg in a brood cell or something, they'll go find established colonies of bumblebees, and then the parasitic bee will either outright just kill the queen of that colony, or somehow subdue her. And it will start laying eggs, and the workers of the host colony will just essentially take care and make sure that those uh, parasitic bee eggs hatch. And then instead of reproducing a bunch of, let's say, like Western bumblebees, you'll get a bunch of the parasite instead. So it's a very interesting life cycle. But yeah, not as common as, say, the brood parasites, the solitary parasites. And so so the bees on the top doing that clamping behavior is also something that you will see with male bees, because they are to some degree they have a similar lack of home. When it comes to solitary bees, the males aren't really doing anything other than like reproducing. So the females are the ones digging the nests up in the ground, or like building their own freestanding nest on a twig. The males are just there to reproduce. And so at night, or if it's cold out, just like the cuckoo parasitic bees, the males just kind of find a place to go, maybe clamp their jaws onto a piece of grass themselves, or they'll go hide in a flower in the case of this one. Um, because again, they have one purpose in life, and that is to mate. Um, and from their perspective, at least that's their reason for existing. That's not to say that they're not important pollinators. In fact, in some cases, they might be equally as important, if not more important than females, because they're not limited to a certain radius around their nest, for example. They can kind of just go wherever they want, wherever they think they'll find a female. This is one of my favorite photos that I've ever taken because not only do you have the female leafcutter bee on the echinacea flower, but you also have that little yellow blur in front. This is actually a male that Leafcutter bee males are very territorial. So if you ever hanging around a patch of flowers and you just see these bees sort of like hovering and they'll like move really quickly to one side and then another, those are usually leafcutter bees, and they'll attack really like any other flying insect that comes into their territory. And then when a female is there, they'll sort of lock onto her like this one is doing, and then they'll fly in and try to mate. Um, so yeah, that's sort of their reason for existing. And so you'll often find them on flowers like this one. Um, Nowhere to go, just kind of hanging out. Sometimes they'll hang out in little aggregations. Um, you'll find like I don't know, a tree branch with a bunch of little male sweat bees or something on it, all cuddled up. I don't know if it's necessarily to keep warm, but it might be just some sort of survival technique. And yeah, so again, these are still bees that need flower, nectar and pollen for their own energy needs. And so they're still going to be visiting flowers. They're just not actually going to those flowers to collect the pollen, but they're still pollinating because, as you can see, they're pretty hairy. So they'll still get pollen stuck to their bodies, and they'll still inadvertently pollinate. And so, just to highlight sort of one of the craziest ways that need for floral resources is exploited is with orchid bees. So again, not something you're going to find in Washington. This is very much like a tropical type of bee, but um, males in this genus, this is Euglossa, they collect a complicated array of like scents. So they're essentially building up a complex perfume that they use to attract females when it's time to mate. Um, and they store it all in this like giant expanded hind tibia. And so the flowers in the tropics that generally offer the more like fragrant scents are orchids, and they will attract male orchid bees to them with that scent. And sometimes, there is actually a reward for those males, but oftentimes there's not. So they'll just trick the males into coming in to the flower, lead them through some elaborate process in the flower, and in that process, the males will crawl through a tight space where they'll get like what's called a pollinia, which is the orchid version of pollen. So these are like little normal pollen grains, you could say. A pollinia is like a big packet of pollen that'll just get like stamped onto the thorax of the bee. And then the bee will emerge out of that orchid all confused and not sure where it is. It'll fly off and, ideally for the orchid, find another of the same species where it will fall for the same trap, crawl through some process where that pollinia will then be pulled off and stuck to the female organ of that new orchid. So males still play a very important role with pollination, and in the tropics, that's a pretty unique example of that. So I'll just finish up with talking a little bit about like native bees and pollinators and why that's such an important topic. In general, native means that a species has been present in that region for a long time, and there's been a long process of evolution that the relationships between that pollinator and the plant species, for example, have been naturally selected for. And when it comes to bees, they often have very specific native host plants that they collect pollen from, and that might be due to nutrition, or it might just be because it's just the way that natural selection worked out. That bee figured out that if they were to take over that ecological niche, then they have a monopoly on that resource. Native bees pollinate seeds and fruits that feed us, obviously, but also birds and bears. And they've co-evolved with all of these parasites and predators that maintain healthy populations of each. And as we know, disturbing ecosystem composition, whether that's through the introduction of non-native species or the removal of native ones, that can often have cascading effects in local ecosystems. And when it comes to native pollinators, the state of their conservation is not good. In North America, like 28% of bumblebees are considered threatened. In 2017, 52% of North American bees species that had enough data were said to be in population decline. In general, insects and especially native bees are just not doing well. And so it's important to ask why. This is a very good diagram that goes very in depth about some of the reasons why native pollinators and insects in general are threatened. I'll just go over a few of them. The first one is introduced species. So um, it's pretty well known that introduced species, whether that be bumblebees or unfortunately honeybees, can compete for resources with native bees. Um, if it's not competition, they may be introducing pathogens that are then affecting wild populations of bees. Um, it's definitely like a developing area of research, especially with regards to honeybees. Um, the difference between honeybees and like other non-native species that can be problematic is that honeybees are here to stay. We're not, they're such an important part of our agricultural system and we rely so heavily on them that it's more a matter of figuring out how native bees can coexist with them than it is about like getting rid of honeybees. um, but it's important to acknowledge that honeybees did not evolve here and that their presence, when it's a colony of tens of thousands, can significantly impact, already stressed communities of native bees where it's just individuals going out and foraging. Another factor that's really important to highlight is urbanization. And I mean, this is the most obvious one probably when it comes to like habitat loss and habitat fragmentation, because bees, bumblebees and honeybees could travel relatively far from their nest sites, but little solitary bees, like some of those sweat bees, they're not going more than like, I don't know, a dozen yards from their nest, maybe even less. Um, and so if habitat becomes fragmented, those populations are going to suffer, especially if the resources that those bees maybe specialize on are not found on that small fragmented island of bee habitat. Um, and this is a problem because what we tend to like and what bees need are usually at odds. Bees like ugly plants. They like broken sticks and bare ground. They like things sort of undisturbed uh, and disturbed, but not in the way that we disturb them usually. Like we like manicured lawns and we like flowers that might be pretty, but they serve no ecological purpose. And we really like cars and driving, and paved roads are not conducive to bee survival. So urbanization is definitely like a really important driver of threats to insects and bees. Um, and so without including the interests of native bees and pollinators in urban planning, that's only going to get worse. The last part of this diagram that I'll highlight is global warming and climate change. This is a bit of a nuanced one because there's the obvious threats like extreme weather happening more often. Bees and all organisms on the earth have always dealt with extreme weather, and that's affected them for eons. But when it comes to like extreme weather happening uh, in events more closely spaced together, um, it doesn't really give them time to recover. They can't really surface for air before the next wave crashes. So that's definitely a huge problem. But the other thing with climate change is that it affects the phenology of both bees and plants. So you have diagrams like this one on the right that show you how to plant native plants in your garden in Western Washington that will provide blooming resources for the entire season. But you can see that, like, say the phenology of two of these plants shifted to the left and then one shifted to the right, and then you have a gap in between there. If there's a bee that requires the pollen or the resources provided by one of those flowers, and it still hatches or emerges and flies during this time, then you're going to have a mismatch. And this is definitely something that a lot of research is still going into because we just don't know that much about every single bee's floral preference and floral requirements. Um, so this is going to be something that will continue to affect native bees and pollinators, and we'll just have to learn as it happens, unfortunately. Um, so what can we do about that? Two things. The first thing that I like to say is to kill your lawn and plant native plants instead. Um, and as beekeepers, this will be good for your colonies, but it'll also be good for all the native bees. Um, Lawns are basically biological deserts. I I mean, at least for me, I prefer to walk around in like a flower garden and stare at all the insects that it attracts rather than just a lawn. Um, and so this is probably the most impactful action that you can take because um, if you get enough people planting natives throughout an urban area, that's really going to help with habitat fragmentation and just provide all the floral resources that are needed for those native pollinators. Bees are very resilient, but only to a certain extent. Um, and there's a lot of research going into how much native pollinator habitat do you need to plant to account for one honeybee colony sort of in a certain area? And it's a lot. It's something like an acre or a couple acres uh, of native pollinator habitat is required to sort of uh, balance out the new competition of a honeybee colony. So definitely planting natives, I would say, is the most important thing. And then more to assist with like gathering information and data about these species, it's really important, I would say, to join organizations like the Washington Bee Atlas or the Native Bee Society. um, so the Bee Atlas, just to remind you, is trying to basically map out every single bee species in Washington, including the host plant associations that they were collected on. And this is crucial because once you start learning these, getting these plant pollinator networks figured out and learning about their nesting requirements and their host plant associations, you can really start to put the picture together and figure out, oh, like this bee, maybe we were finding it 5 years ago and it's severely declined now, and you can figure out why that might be happening. Maybe we need to plant more of their host flower, things like that. So I would encourage you to learn more about these native bees, and perhaps get involved with organizations that are working to discover more about them. And yeah, that is my presentation. So happy to answer any more questions you have. Yeah, talk all about bees.
Thank you so much, Aidan. That was wonderful. Really, really lots of great information. Um, is there a place to like you talked about that Washington Bee Atlas?
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, how do we like if we just take pictures in our yard, do we upload them on there or
So the Bee Atlas specifically is like a program that we train volunteers to go out and collect bees. So it involves like actually killing bees and sending them in for
oh,
identification. Um, because
is
unfortunately, with a
there
lot of bees, you actually need to look at them under a microscope to figure out what species they are.
okay.
Yeah, the Native Bee Society, which I'm a board member at, again, is like more of an educational, I'd say,
Yeah.
organization. We have discussions about whether or not we should have events where we're actually taking or not. But for the most part, it's more of like educational. So yeah.
Is there like a citizen science photography site where you could upload photos?
I mean, iNaturalist, of course, is
I
like
naturalist.
yeah, that's where I would say the majority of citizen science is going on. That's what the Bee Atlas uses to post like the host plant associations.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, I'm usually on iNaturalist a lot, so if I ever see bees that are posted, I'll try to ID them. But yeah, that's
Hmm.
usually the best way to go about it.
Okay. Because that seems like that would be an easy way for people to get involved.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Anybody else have questions? Yes, there are prints. If you love some of these pictures, Aidan has them for sale on his website, which is posted in the comments there. Yeah, they're beautiful photographs.
Thank you. Yeah,
I
it's
think my favorite was the one in the yellow flower.
the male.
The one right after the one that you
Oh, I
said was
know.
your favorite.
Yeah, I know which one. Let's
It's
see.
just amazing the colors that they have. I mean, the orchid bee is beautiful too, but some of our native ones, yeah, that one, the eyes.
Yeah, they're up close. They're just fascinating.
Very, very cool. Travis gave us a question in the comments. Which bees do not sting?
Um, so, well, the short answer is male bees. So stingers are basically evolutionarily modified ovipositors. So what parasitic wasps, for example, use to lay eggs, that then evolved into a stinger for bees and some other wasps. So since males never laid eggs in the first place, males don't have stingers. That being said, there are different bees that either they may not have the ability to sting even as a female because the stinger may just be so small. Um, but you know, a good rule of thumb is that if it's a male bee, it can't sting you. If it's a female bee, it can sting you. Yeah.
Yeah, I was always told that mason bees didn't sting, and then my kids were holding them and they got
Mhm.
stung. And I was like, oh
Yeah.
well, guess they
Yeah.
do.
There's a lot of variability among like well, obviously the level of pain. Sometimes when I'm trying to get a little bee out of my net or something, I'll mishandle it and it'll just like it's like a little pin prick or something on the finger.
Mm.
Honestly, though, in my experience, the honeybee stings are the worst of all the bees. So, yeah,
They're pretty protective.
yeah.
Very cool. Good questions. Well, thank you so much. If does anybody else have any other questions?
You did a fantastic job. Everybody's happy with the presentation, and just thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you
Yeah.
for inviting me. I'm pretty excited about it.
We're sorry that it ended up being over Zoom.
That's all good. Yeah, I
It
almost
worked
Hey,
didn't
we'd
out.
make
rather
it.
keep people safe.
Yeah, I almost didn't make it over Snoqualmie Pass when I was coming out. But yeah,
What I've learned from this is to be mindful of what I plant according to the number of hives I have on my property. To be aware that the honeybees are a tiny part of the foragers so necessary out there. So
yeah,
thanks.
yeah. Of course, I'm glad you took that away from it because it is. Um, I don't know a ton about like sort of the coordination between like the honeybee community and beekeeper community, but yeah, it seems like uh, understanding like the concentration of hives in a certain area is a pretty important thing to do when it comes to conservation of native bees because you could be like flooding that sort of local ecosystem with just honeybees and not really know it if you're not in contact with each other.
Well, actually, Mary and were really pushing that last year because we found that when we started our apiary, it really wasn't pulling in that much because all around Puyallup is just compacted with a lot of different beekeepers and hives. And then we actually found that when we were discussing, like, we wanted to add more hives, right? We were talking about the impact to the community and how it would look for everybody, and saying that we weren't sure if it would support the amount that we were looking at. And we actually got a lot of pushback from people just kind of saying, well, we just want the hives, just put them in. Or, and it was just kind of interesting to hear where we were trying to be responsible, right?
Yeah.
And not have to feed our hives as much as we saw that we needed to our first year opening that apiary back up. And so I advocate absolutely for that message. It's true. And if
Yeah.
we're struggling just to feed our bees, then what happens then to the native bees? I mean,
Yeah, totally.
not much less for them, right?
Yeah.
And I think along tagging on to that is the concept that we actually don't have permission, so to speak, to mess with the whole ecosystem just so we can have 12 colonies on a quarter acre of land, let's say. It messes up the whole ecosystem all around.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really about keeping in mind the big picture, I think, huh? Like we don't want to exclude anybody. The honeybees will eat everything, but we need to make sure that there's some left for our native pollinator friends.
Yeah.
I know I love seeing them. I see little leaf cutter holes on my roses and my what is that one? It's like serviceberry. They
Oh,
love that
yeah.
one.
Yeah. If you ever get the chance to watch them actually cutting them up, it's pretty fun. It's just like I don't know. It's just fun to watch them like sort of wrangle with the leaf cutting and then fly off with it in their legs. It's awesome.
Yeah, I'll have to sit out there and stalk them this year.
Well, and it goes along with Mary Klein's presentation that she did last year, and she also discussed native pollinators and saying that they are all very highly specialized, right, to specific plants, as honeybees can just really go anywhere. So the impact is even heavier than we truly know or understand.
Yeah, definitely. There are some native bees that, will also do that. They'll just go for generalist pollinators. But yeah, I mean, some entire like genera of bees are that every single species is like specialized on one type of plant. So
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, is anyone else, does anyone else have anything to say?
I don't
Okay.
think so. That was
Well, Aidan,
great.
thank you so much. Yeah.
yeah, thank you.
And make it home safe back over the path.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, bud.
I was talking with my mute on, but thanks, Aidan, for sharing the photos, because you could have done that talk and it would have been great without the photos, but those are incredible.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right, bye-bye.
All right, good night.
I've got this recorded, or we got it recorded. If you guys would like a copy, go ahead and email into education@bcbeekeepers.org. I'll put it right here.
Stop the recording now, I guess.